Thanks. So thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available following the webinar on the INEE website. The presentation slides for this webinar will also be available on the site along with the recording. If you've registered for this webinar, which of course all of you have if you're here, you will receive an email from us after the webinar is complete with the link to the recording and the presentation. So this webinar is also being closed captioned. So at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see an option to turn on the closed captioning, which is available in English today. Please let us know in the chat if you have any issues with that. You'll notice that your video and audio are disabled. This is to optimize bandwidth since we'll have lots of people joining in for this webinar. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen as well, next to the chat function. Please try to use the Q&A function for your questions and refrain from putting any questions in the chat box. And if you could please add the name of the person you prefer to answer your question along with your question at the very beginning, we'll do our best to get your questions answered during the Q&A portion. So let's get started. Rachel, can you move to the next slide for us? Thanks. So my name is Margie Bott. You may have seen my face before on these webinars for the Policy Working Group. I am the Education Policy Coordinator at INEE, or the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, for those who may not be familiar. Many of you are, of course, members already of INEE, but if you're not, I encourage you to visit inee.org and click on the top right side of your screen and become a member. We have, of course, a very exciting agenda, as you see, for today's webinar. I'll provide a brief introduction to INEE for those who are less familiar and share with you the purpose of this webinar. I'll introduce our presenters and panelists. I'll situate the work for us within INEE, and then we'll get a brief presentation of the paper itself, followed by a panel discussion, a question and answers portion, and then finally a conclusion. So to begin, I'd like to share a brief introduction of INEE. We are an open global network of members working together within the humanitarian and development framework to ensure that all individuals have the right to quality, safe, relevant, and equitable education. We are made up of more than 18,000 individual members and 130 partner organizations across 190 countries. Our members are NGO and UN personnel, Ministry of Education, and other government staff, students, teachers, donors, researchers who all work collectively to achieve a shared goal of increasing access to quality education opportunities in education and emergency contexts. We believe that working together, we can achieve greater impact and influence. Rachel, if you go to the next slide, this kind of shows you the philosophy of change that INEE is working towards. So as a sector, we think that we can have greater impact if we all come together and collectively make that change. Next slide, Rachel. Thanks. So the purpose of this webinar is to share with you a policy paper that has been 3 years in the making. The paper is entitled Investing in Learning, the Case for Strengthening the Collection and Use of Learning Assessment Data in Education and Emergency Contexts. We'll share the link for this paper with you in the chat box. It's available in all INEE languages, so you can read it in Arabic, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. The paper provides guidance on how to increase and improve the measurement of holistic learning outcomes in EiE sector specifically, and it's for donors, national governments, and humanitarian and development agencies. It provides recommendations for EiE stakeholders to improve the measurement of learning outcomes for children and youth in crisis contexts. You'll hear more about the paper in just a bit, but before that, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters and panelists. Presenters and panelists, if you could just turn your camera on for this bit so everyone can see your face. perhaps give a quick wave when I come to you. So we have Gerhard Pulfer, who is responsible for education and displacement at Porticus. Gerhard is also the co-chair of the Quality and Equitable Learning Outcomes workstream within the Education Policy Working Group at INEE. We also have Audrey Nerengarten. She is the task team leader at Agence Française de Développement, and she also co-chairs the workstream with Gerhard within the Policy Working Group. We have Catherine Johnston, who is our consultant and expert in teacher professional development, refugee and migrant education policy, and the author of this policy paper that we're sharing with you. Joining us is also her colleague, Andrea Sirota. She's also a consultant and an expert in participatory qualitative research, program design and management, as well as advocacy and technical advising. We have Benoit Dansambourg. He is the Senior Education Officer at UNHCR and serves as the co-chair of the INEE Steering Group. Also welcoming Julia Finder-Jonah, who is the Education and Emergencies Advisor at Save the Children and the co-chair of the INEE PSS-SEL Collaborative. She is also a member of this workstream who produced this paper within the Education Policy Working Group at INEE. And her fellow co-chair of the PSS-SEL Collaborative is Dr. Sylvia Diaz-Granados Ferranz, who is the Associate Director for Education Research at the International Rescue Committee. She's also a member of this workstream as well. We also have Dr. Christian Stoff with us, who is the Head of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Global Reporting at Education Cannot Wait. Christian also co-chairs the new INEE Education and Emergency Data Reference Group. We welcome Nina Weisenhorn, who is the Senior Advisor in Education and Crisis and Conflict for USAID Center for Education. Nina is also a member of this workstream and within the Education Policy Working Group. She also co-chairs the INEE Humanitarian Development Task Force. We also have Yeva Rodenite with us today. She's the Associate Research Officer in the UNESCO IIEP Research and Development Team. Just want to see if our other colleague has joined us today. I don't think he's able to have logged on, so we'll keep an eye out for him. But before we get going, I just wanted to say we are very grateful to all of you, our panelists and presenters who have contributed to this work, and we're very excited to launch this paper today and have a discussion with you about it. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at INEE who are supporting this webinar today and have done much more than that for this piece of work. So thank you, Alana Christopher, who supported the fruition of this work while I was on parental leave, and Rachel Smith, who is INEE's PSS-SEL Phenom. We appreciate you both. Thank you for your help today. So with that, can you go to the next slide, Rachel? I just want to share with you all a quick visual of INEE network spaces. There's a lot going on at INEE always, as many of you know, and this visual just captures some of that work. Rachel, if you click next, an arrow will hopefully pop up. There we go. So this work actually fits within the Quality and Equitable Learning Outcomes workstream in the Policy Working Group. So you can kind of see in the visual among all of the different pieces of work going on at INEE where this work sits. And with that, I'll pass it off to Audrey Nerengarten, our co-chair for this workstream, who will tell us a little bit more about how we've gotten to here. Thanks, Audrey.
Thank you very much, Margie. So just a quick note to explain who we are and what was our starting point for this work. So the INEE Quality and Equitable Learning Outcomes workstream, called QELO, I'm not sure my accent is good, but let's say QELO, is constituted of various members from NGOs, from donors, but also some researchers. The idea is that we all volunteered with support from our organizations with a view to contribute to the development of education in emergencies, and in particular to support stronger enhancements of quality in education. Indeed, what motivated our work is our belief that you certainly all share, that in order to achieve SDG 4 by 2030, there is a need for a sector-wide shift from access towards a recognition, from focus on access towards a stronger recognition of learning. Next slide, please. So our objectives have been to, in order to support children to access better learning and quality opportunities, is to better understand how we can help support assessment of learning. So with this in mind, we try to identify different bottlenecks that prevent this focus on quality, and understand what kind of tools can be used to support better measurement. So we undertook, two mapping exercises with an aim to better document the different elements that could support practitioners, Ministry of Education, to focus on learning and create a dialogue around these issues. Next, please. Sorry, Alana, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So we undertook two mappings to identify measurement tools and approaches, as well as monitoring and results framework. These two mappings provide or cover programmatic measurement approaches, global measurement frameworks, assessment tools, and monitoring and results frameworks, which are used by different practitioners in the field. We launched a survey that helped to identify these tools. The quality and equitable education in emergency constitutes, and how it can be assessed at the program and individual learning levels. So the mapping also provides overview of measurement tools, frameworks, and approaches, and compare each assessment with regard to their purpose, design, target population. We also try to analyze commonality assessed by the different measurement tools. In addition to a comparative description of the various elements that were identified, the mapping provides cost information and a discussion of progress in measuring global goals. These two mappings aim to really provide a comprehensive overview of the different competencies that children should acquire, not only academic, but also social and emotional competencies and learning. The idea is indeed to focus on holistic measures of learning for children. What's next, please? So what we also thought after these two mappings is that we needed to go further in terms of advocacy. So the policy paper that will be presented now was designed with a view to build the case for measuring learning outcomes across the whole education spectrum, be it in crisis or in development settings. So as mentioned, the idea was also to cover the whole spectrum of learning needs, whatever the situation children were. So the objectives of the paper were indeed to give tools to further advocate towards donors who have a key role to play in engaging, providing incentives for measuring learning, but also ministries of education, different implementing partners, and organizations providing education. The idea was that the policy paper would also provide access to the existing tools to encourage the use of these tools, and facilitate a joint dialogue in country across humanitarian and development actors around the issue of quality education. How is it defined? in a given environment, and how can we identify the various needs of learners and better follow their progress and tracks. So the policy paper was also meant to identify ways to lift barriers regarding the use of these measurements, support to how to adapt them to different contexts, and provide talking points for discussion to better capture crisis-affected populations in national assessments. Next slide, please. So what comes next is to see how we can jointly disseminate the messages. And that's going to be a part of our discussion today, and we certainly count on you to help us do this, to further see how better measurement can be undertaken in a more holistic way, in a more equitable way for all children. We also seek to better work within the INEE with other work streams. And certainly we are looking for opportunities to pilot this paper in some discussion in countries to really see how it can, as it was the initial aim, facilitate dialogue across actors. So thank you for this. We hope the discussion will provide further ideas to advocate for quality and equitable learning for all children.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for situating that work for us within the work stream that's been working on this project. Next, I'd like to hand it off to Catherine Johnston, who was the author of this paper, to present us with what's in the paper. Thanks, Catherine.
You're welcome. Hopefully everybody is able to hear me clearly. So thank you so much, Margie, for the introduction, and also for kind of detailing kind of the policy paper objectives. And Audrey certainly has provided sufficient detail, so I won't labour on them in the introduction. Only to say that we did substantially differentiate according to those key sort of audience groups. So for donors in humanitarian and protracted crisis contexts, this paper guides policy and resource priorities towards holistic learning assessments for children and youth in conflict and crisis contexts in order to ensure that scarce investments translate into real learning outcomes and child wellbeing. For national governments, this paper proposes that national governments promote more equitable, holistic and inclusive national and subnational learning assessments to support teaching and learning in hard to reach areas, including conflict and crisis contexts. And for humanitarian development agencies, this paper provides specific guidance on measuring holistic learning outcomes in conflict and crisis contexts. And we share progress and lessons from the field on the importance of assessment, contextualization and data visualization, data validation. We also emphasise the importance of going beyond administering learning assessments to consider how learning assessment data can be used to improve the quality of education in EiE contexts. Next slide. So I'll outline now the process that we undertook to arrive at drafting the paper. Essentially, we undertook a sort of an in-depth desk review of primary and secondary literature on current practices and efforts to improve the measurement of learning in EiE contexts. And we undertook some key informant interviews and focus group discussions that included very lively debates with the QELO workstream, donors, UNHCR and humanitarian and development agencies active in the EiE sector and INEE. We utilised a kind of four-step process, which was quite sort of iterative. In the desk review, we did a thorough kind of review of available literature and resources to identify key information to inform the policy paper. The INEE mapping reports, of course, and the measurement library resources were reviewed alongside secondary source documents on the opportunities, challenges and obstacles in shifting from an access focus towards a quality learning outcomes focused in the EiE sector. The literature review informed the following: the primary and secondary audience typologies, the key message categories, priority areas for brainstorming and consultation, basic guidance on the design and administration of academic and PSS-SEL assessments in crisis conflict settings, possible case studies, and also guidance on costing in action. The brainstorming exercise was probably the most interesting insofar as we undertook kind of 3 basic tasks in the brainstorming piece. We proposed a complex question and did brainstorming around that question, and then from there reviewed a set of messages that had been drawn from the literature review and had been kind of placed under thematic sort of areas of focus. And we asked of the participants in the brainstorm to kind of identify those messages that kind of aligned with a key audience group. So that was a really interesting kind of undertaking, and I think it helped to refine our thinking of what might be the most suitable messages for a given audience. We followed that up with some focus group discussions, and in the focus group discussions we initially had a focus group discussion with the workstream to consider the top line policy messages, and then we had a follow-up series of focus group discussions based on audience type to test those messages out directly with the audience type. The final kind of piece in the puzzle, we did some kind of little surveys. Of course, everything was online, so it was good. We utilised technology for it, but we did some surveys just to help us kind of confirm terminology that would suit this paper, frame, and obviously do some of the design elements of the final report. Okay, next. We thought that I'll just outline a bit of the structure of the policy paper just to help you navigate its contents. It was quite difficult to land the structure of the policy paper as there are a number of kind of interrelated issues that are relevant to assessment of learning in conflict and crisis settings, and the paper had to be easily accessible to different target audiences which have different backgrounds, knowledge and experiences. We spent a lot of time narrowing the focus to essential elements, issues that were relevant to assessment. And to do this, it helped to explicitly define what we mean by quality education, why it is particularly important for conflict and crisis affected children, and the global commitment that has been made. And this helped us to formulate and articulate a problem statement and to then discuss the dimensions of the problem, which is the essence of part 1 of the paper. Part 2 then sought to elaborate on the key issues to help frame policy dialogue. And part 2 covers key kind of topics like why learning assessments are important, how to measure quality learning in conflict and crisis contexts, working together, building better data management systems, and the cost of inaction. And each section or issue within part 2 is structured in the same way, with key messages up front, a narrative around it, around why it's important, and recent global efforts that have been undertaken to address it, with some further actions that are specific to that issue. It was hoped that in this way, discrete sections of the paper could be extracted and used by you if and when needed. Part 3 draws out the high-level recommendations for each audience, namely donors, national governments, and humanitarian development actors. And part 4 is meant to be kind of the action section. It's the final section, and it seeks to guide readers towards exploring and utilising the INEE measurement library and provides links to the background papers and INEE networks. We hope it is a clean and easy to navigate policy paper, as it is not, it's not an easy topic to frame. And we also hope that you take the time to read it fully, and that it helps you with your internal and external advocacy efforts to improve the learning outcomes of children in conflict and crisis settings. Next slide. And finally, I thought Andrew and I just did a brainstorm of the things, the insights that I suppose resonated with us. So I'll just touch on a few of these now. So a few insights that Andrew and I felt were particularly strong, perhaps not new, but certainly critical to the discussion on measuring learning in conflict and crisis contexts. These are the need to focus on the full spectrum of learning needs. Whilst measuring SEL is a rapidly emerging field, studies show that these factors are important predictors of better education, employment, and life outcomes. The second, assessment in education and emergencies needs to be underpinned by established principles of humanitarian development action, including principles of do no harm and conflict sensitivity. It must also include a framework for ethical decision-making that ensures assessment efforts do not fuel exclusion or stigmatisation, nor harm crisis-affected children and youth by applying standardised national assessments to their learning. The third point, teachers are central to any discussion on assessment for learning and of learning. We noted that the demand for reporting drives accountability upwards rather than towards communities affected by crisis and conflict, and this limits the utility of learning assessments as an instrument to improve teaching and learning in the EiE contexts. The fourth point, we identified 4 dimensions to the problem on how we can increase momentum on measuring holistic learning in crisis and conflict settings. The first being that learning assessments typically do not include SEL and PSS dimensions. The second, that children and youth in conflict and crisis contexts are often invisible in national government assessment systems. The fourth, the ineffective use of learning assessment data makes it harder for learning improvements to be made. And the fourth, the assessment systems lack coherence from the classroom to the national and international level, and this really extends to conflict and crisis contexts. A further point is that we felt that assessments can play a critical role in bridging humanitarian and development approaches and maintaining a focus on learning throughout the response and recovery continuum. And we found this particular quote very poignant. A measurement tool can catalyse practitioners, researchers and policymakers to become a global network working towards the collective goal of improving education. It allows for diverse partners to have a shared metric and language. So this the final point, this realisation that this work has already started, and there's been so much good progress to date, particularly in the area of building better data management systems. And we noted kind of the work of Education Cannot Wait, Global Partnership for Education, UNESCO's work, and others such as World Bank in this particular area. And so, you know, it was pleasing to kind of, I suppose, note the progress that's already being made in this space. The final few points, particularly around the cost of inaction, that assessments are expensive, but not assessing learning outcomes comes at an enormous cost. And without the ability to systematically assess learning outcomes, there are many reasons, but there's many reasons of the effect of them, but fundamentally without assessments, we cannot mitigate the learning crisis. So that's my final sort of thoughts on that. So over to you, Margie. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And yes, certainly not an easy discussion to capture across the many individuals we spoke with throughout the process for developing this paper. I think we've put together a strong and hopefully very accessible paper that is very useful for the audience. And I hope the participants that have joined today will take a look. Once again, the paper is available in all INEE languages, so please do share across your networks and colleagues, and we thank you for that. So before we move on to the exciting panel discussion, I am glad to say that our last panelist was able to join us, for which I'm very thankful. I'd like to introduce Elias Abdi, who's the Director General in the Ministry of Education in Kenya. DG Abdi, we're very thankful for your time with us today, and we're so glad that you're here. So with that, I'll hand it off to our moderator, Gerhard, to lead us in this panel discussion. Thanks, Gerhard.
Thanks a lot, Margie. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Good night to Catherine in Australia. And I'm very excited that we can discuss this policy paper today. I think the policy paper was drafted in order to create commitment. And the next step is how to turn this commitment into policy and also into frontline practice. And today we have on this panel a range of colleagues from international organizations, from government, from international NGOs and bilateral donors who already have a commitment to turning the idea of holistic learning assessment measurement into practice. So I would thus first like to ask the panelists what the measurement of holistic learning outcomes means in their respective contexts and why this is important in their context. And I would first like to give the floor to the Director General Abdi to talk about the measurement of holistic learning outcome and inclusion of refugees in the national education system in Kenya. Director General, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just want to again appreciate you for giving me this opportunity to be with you, the international colleagues in the sector. I just want to start by saying that Kenya hosts a large number of refugee community. You know the famous Dadaab and the Kakuma in towards the border with South Sudan. Also, I also want to mention that in terms of education in emergency, education is under attack in some part of the country. You have heard about the attack at the university in Garissa some years back. But the counties in Kenya that are bordering Somalia now, teachers have left in large number as a result of insecurity. Out of 700 schools, we have 300 schools that have only the head teachers and there are no teachers. So we have those challenges in terms of that. But on the refugee question, we are a country, especially one of the main countries that have included refugees in the education system. The refugees in this country sit Kenyan curriculum, they sit Kenyan examination. Their teachers are trained within the Kenyan system. And over the years, a number of refugee learners were able to succeed through the education system in Kenya. And others have ended up in universities in the West, in the US, in Europe, and so on, from this education system in Kenya. Having said that, coming back to the question, what does it mean to measure holistic learning? Holistic learning to us is very critical because an education system exists, our schools exist because of learning. Anything else that is there, including even the teaching, is supposed to enable learning. So to us, it is very critical. And the holistic measurement, because they say what gets measured gets done. You know, and therefore, we've just had the previous presenter talk about, you know, assessment for learning. So holistic, you know, measurement would want to, you know, we measure in order to improve the learning itself and so that the teachers can get feedback to be able to adjust their teaching and to be able to address individual difference between the learners. Learners in a class are divided into fast learners, average learners, and slow learners. And therefore, the teacher, through measurement and feedback as a result of the assessment, is able to adjust. And the assessment tools that are available are through observation. A teacher, while teaching, can observe the facial expression of the learners and so on. The use of checklists, discussions, interviews, schedules, the use of oral questions, written tests, projects. This to us is what is being used. And at the end of it, this is important because it's expected to impart the knowledge, the skills and attitudes and values that the education system is supposed to impart to the learners. And therefore, again, you know very well that in any education system, there are inputs in form of supply of teachers, teaching and learning materials, infrastructure, and all this. So it is important to measure to see whether we're getting value for money, because money is being invested domestically, internationally, by donors, and so on. So learning is really critical. And therefore, the only way we can measure learning is through assessments. And it's through those assessments now that we take policy decisions through the learning data that comes from the classroom. We're able to make policy decisions and interventions to ensure that every child is able to portray the competencies at every level of education, be it early grade, middle school, or junior school, or senior school. Every level of education has got its own competencies the learner is supposed to acquire. At early grade, it's about the numeracy, it's about the literacy of the learner, for him to progress to the next level, up to until maybe at university education. So in Kenya, for example, we are just illustrating this for years. You know, we had our own challenges because we're getting situations where graduates of the system there was mismatch between what is learned in the education system and what the labor market requires. And recently, we have now moved to the competence-based curriculum, ensuring that we inculcate the 21st century skills, competencies of communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and problem solving, imagination, and creativity, so that the school system is able to produce an all-round person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director General, for your clear words. I would then like to hand over to Benoit. Benoit, UNHCR has a policy of inclusion of refugees and displaced people into national education systems. So how does UNHCR feel the relevance of learning assessment, and what are the challenges from your perspective?
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon. I can only echo what Director General Abdi has just said on the importance of learning assessments. But with refugees, we have a couple of particular challenges. Refugees, along other children and youth in conflict and crisis context, are invisible in national governments' learning assessments, as you can read in the paper on page 11. Before talking about learning assessment for refugee children and youth, we need to know where they go to school. You cannot know how a student is doing at school if you don't know where she or he goes to school. School administrative data are available in camp. Such is the case in Kenya. But in many places, we just don't have the data. Challenges include lack of data on access in urban area, for example, or the invisibility of refugees in national systems, perhaps the latter being the trickiest challenge. As you've said, Gerhard, UNHCR advocates for the inclusion of refugee students into national education systems in line with the Global Compact on Refugees. That implies also inclusion of refugee students into national education management information systems, EMIS. But that comes with a couple of challenges, because first of all, you need to check if national systems are able to disaggregate the data and making sure that we actually can collect the data for refugees. This is more like a technical issue. But there's also perhaps some situations where we don't want to disaggregate the data, because disaggregating the data in the classrooms could lead to stigmatization or discrimination. So what we need to do is to reconcile two different issues: our need for data on both access and learning, with our concerns about protection. We need to develop a proper protocol to be used in all refugee situations to allow the collection of data we need in a safe and rigorous manner. In conclusion, in order to make refugees visible in learning assessments and also in SDG 4 reporting, we need to simultaneously work on data on access and on data on learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benoit, for explaining the challenges from your perspective. I would next like to ask Sylvia. The International Rescue Committee is a large international NGO and has developed and tested measurement tools for education in emergencies. Why is this important to you, and what are the challenges based on your experience?
Thank you, Gerhard. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, collecting data on holistic learning outcomes is very important because, as Catherine mentioned earlier, we really need to go beyond academic learning to understand the importance of other skills that will help children succeed and thrive in life, such as social emotional learning skills. Additionally, a critical element for improving the quality of education and children's learning, social emotional skills and their well-being, is having information. And so the collection and feedback of data about whether children are learning allows for a common understanding of whether goals are being met and whether resources are well used, which actually also allows for accountability and quality improvement of processes. Having information about what works to improve children's holistic learning outcomes, as well as how, where, for whom, and at what cost, can really drive program and policy decision making. One of the main challenges, though, to achieve this is that not only data is often not being collected, and such that children, their access to school and their learning outcomes and their social emotional learning skills are often invisible to education systems, but that the ability to effectively generate and use the information depends on the availability of instruments that are valid and reliable for use with a specific target population. And unfortunately, many tools for collecting information on children's learning outcomes and social emotional skills and well-being in context of conflict and crisis are inadequate. And so, holistic learning outcomes and development outcomes such as literacy, numeracy, social emotional learning, well-being are frequently assessed using measures that are either too difficult for children to even answer them properly, or they're like not contextually valid, or they're deficit oriented. There are important measures like social emotional learning skills, the measures that exist and the instruments that are often being used to capture those outcomes are typically measured with self-reports, which we know are often biased because what children and even adults report their skills do not actually match with their levels of skills and competencies. So it's important that we also then have instruments that are feasible, that are valid, that are reliable, that are also, often performance-based to capture some of these important holistic learning skills.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was very informative. I would like to turn to Julia next. And Julia, Save the Children is another large international NGO that has also developed measurement tools specifically for EiE contexts and displacement contexts like ICELA, HALO, IDELA. Could you talk about your experience in with those tools, with measurement, and why Save the Children finds it relevant and important?
Sure, thanks, Gerhard. So I think it's very important to measure holistic learning outcomes because we know that there is a direct connection between children's well-being and their ability to learn. And that taking a truly holistic approach to education is the only way that we will provide children with access to real quality learning opportunities that do address that full spectrum of learning needs. And as more education programs, especially in education and emergencies contexts, are integrating psychosocial support and social emotional learning into their approaches, it's critically important that we are also measuring the development of those skills the exact same way that we measure literacy and numeracy. You know, unfortunately, there are some challenges with this in the field, and there's kind of two main challenges that I'd like to just have us think about. And firstly, when it comes to measuring PSS and SEL, right, oftentimes different names are used to refer to the same skill, and the same skill may have different definitions. And so this creates challenges in measuring those skills because without understanding how skills are really being defined or conceptualized, it can potentially result in having a measure that does not accurately assess the skill we're actually trying to develop. Secondly, we know that the culture and the context greatly influence social emotional development and the norms for social behavior. Yet, there's a real lack of evidence and research from contexts of conflict and crisis, meaning that the evidence base we have does not really reflect the specific needs and populations of EiE contexts. Thus, this issue of terminology and context presents several challenges for measuring these skills. With our tools that we've developed, I think what's been very important is to make sure that the skills that the tools are measuring directly correspond with the skills that we're aiming to teach in our program, and that there's this harmony between how we measure the skill and how we teach it.
Thank you so much, Julia. I would next like to ask Eva. The UNESCO IEP has issued a paper on the issue of learning assessment data in the education planning cycle. And so what relevance do you attach to measurement in conflict and crisis, to assessment conflict and crisis? And what have you identified as challenges in regular education systems, but perhaps more for education in emergencies?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. And I would like to come back to this issue of the use of learning assessment data. As you might have seen, we have just issued a number of policy briefs that explore in depth the issue of the use of learning assessment data. And although this study has not been implemented in crisis and conflict affected zones and areas, it generated a number of very important lessons that indeed span the nexus of humanitarian and development nexus. I think that it is very important to come back to the issue of the use of data, as we've seen that, of course, first of all, we need to have data, disaggregated data on how youth and children are learning, especially in crisis-affected contexts. However, very often we saw in our research that even in countries that this data are increasingly available, actually they are not used to their full potential for many different reasons. We saw in our countries that many education development plans as well as policies finally are not successfully informed by these data. And this is why it is very important to think about the use right from the beginning. So we noticed a number of challenges in our study, and I will just focus on a couple of them here. So we saw that very often assessments and assessment systems are implemented as external initiatives in countries, and they are also very often supported by development partners. And they indeed played a very important role while developing these crucial assessment systems. However, one of the unintended consequences of this, and especially in contexts with very fragile institutional frameworks and low capacities, was that this resulted in a limited ownership and national leadership in learning assessment data, which negatively influenced its use. So actually, we saw that the weaker the capacities in the country, the more limited ownership emerged around learning assessment data, and therefore its use remained limited. So this issue was also even worsened by a lack of capacities to produce and use learning assessment data. And I think that these are indeed very crucial elements to think about, because without an effective use of data, they cannot successfully inform policies, and they cannot improve student learning outcomes, which is also, of course, promoted by the QELO policy brief. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva, for talking about this aspect of measurement. It's not only about the measurement itself, but about the use of data, which is the eventual purpose of any assessment. So we have talked now about the purpose of measurement, the relevance of measurement, and also the challenges. But they are not only challenges, they are also solutions. And many of the panelists here have also been involved in working and have worked on concrete solutions. And I would here like to turn to Nina from USAID, since I know that USAID has been very active in this field and has last year issued policies around the assessment of holistic learning measurement outcomes. So Nina, over to you.
Thanks so much, Gerhard, and to the rest of the panel for the insights that you've shared thus far. At USAID, in our 2018 education policy, we clearly laid out our commitment for measuring holistic learning outcomes and have defined foundational skills as reading, math, and social emotional learning. We partner with education authorities, teachers, and civil society to strengthen assessment and data systems across the education continuum. And despite many of the challenges that my colleagues have highlighted, USAID has been leading efforts to expand use of a few key measurement frameworks and tools for both basic education learners and youth in non-formal education and workforce development programs. First, I'd like to highlight the ways in which we're building off the long-standing commitment to reading and reading measurement through our collaboration with the World Bank and others to develop the Global Proficiency Framework, which provides a detailed look at skills and sub-skills that have to be mastered in grades 1 through 9 for reading and math. With this framework, we have supported education authorities to develop proficiency benchmarks and are encouraging our partners in ministries of education and our implementing partners to ensure that those benchmarks are contextualized and set with an understanding of how learning and what learning is possible for crisis-affected populations. This framework and the method called policy linking of setting proficiency benchmarks has been piloted in a few of our partner countries for early grades, in particular in 2 states in northern Nigeria, in Kenya, in Malawi, and in Djibouti. We're also exploring how this framework can be applied in accelerated education settings in conjunction with the Accelerated Education Working Group, and looking at how the Global Proficiency Framework provides us a resource for equivalency and to lead towards accreditation and recognition of accelerated learning programs. For youth populations, USAID has funded the development, piloting, and validation of the Youth Soft Skills Assessment for youth ages 15 to 19. These tools are designed to measure positive self-concept, higher order thinking skills, social skills, and communication skills. And for many of our partners who might be listening, you may have also noticed that USAID is increasingly including required reporting on learning outcomes for all of our project beneficiaries, both children and youth, as well as working to disaggregate that data for crisis-affected learners in our awards. We ask for your support in these efforts. We know that there are challenges, but we also are so pleased to be working with many of you to develop validated, simple, and realistic tools that you can integrate into program implementation. We're also engaging with multilateral organizations such as UNICEF and the World Bank, and pooled funds such as Education Cannot Wait to integrate measures of holistic learning outcomes into our monitoring and reporting, so that together we can set a new standard as donors and multilaterals to be able to support our National Ministry of Education partners to really work together and build a system that is resilient to the shocks and stressors that are faced throughout the academic year, and really capture with disaggregated data the learning that's happening in the classroom level and help inform decision-making so that we can improve the systems for learners and teachers all the way across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. That is very encouraging to hear. Sylvia, you talked before about the need to have reliable and valid measurement tools to make sure that what measures is actually reflecting the learning outcomes and also the skills and competences. Would you like to talk about your involvement in developing and measuring and validating the tools jointly with NYU?
Thank you. Yes, exactly. In trying to address the challenges that I discussed before, the lack of feasible, valid, and reliable tools to capture holistic learning outcomes, the IRC has been collaborating with the NYU in the Evidence to Action Measurement and Metrics Initiative, which aims to accelerate the ability that stakeholders have to generate actionable evidence in context of conflict and crisis by basically engaging with others in designing, adapting, testing, building capacity to use high quality measures of children's holistic learning outcomes, as well as high quality measures to capture the processes that promote those learning outcomes, so the implementation quality of interventions that aim to support the development of those outcomes. The initiative first convened a consortium of research practice partnerships in the Middle East and North Africa and Turkey, the MENA region, including partners from organizations such as Save the Children, War Child, NRC, Queen Mary University of London, and others. And as a result of this work, we produced the INEE measurement library, which is available to everyone. I'll share a link in a minute, and which is also referenced in the QELO paper. And the library contains a ton of resources for people interested in assessing children's learning and children's holistic learning outcomes. And so, for example, if you go into the library, you will find assessment tools to capture social emotional learning skills, and also the quality of implementation of programs. You will also find all the reports that show evidence of validity and reliability of those tools for a specific purpose and for a specific setting. You will also find training materials. Sometimes the tools may be available, but then, we have identified that a barrier to actually conducting high quality data is the lack of training materials. And so the tools come with training materials that people can then use and adapt for their own context, and as well as a measurement guidance document that helps stakeholders identify whether the tools that are available in the measurement library meet their needs, or whether they need to engage in a process of adapting them and collecting evidence of validity and reliability. We continue to work to increase the number of tools and the resources that are available in the measurement library, and we expect that this will really address that issue of the lack of valid and reliable tools, so that stakeholders in EiE Contexts can start generating high quality data to inform decision making. I'm going to share here the link to the measurement library, which sits at the INEE website, and I encourage everybody to use it and take advantage of this really good resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, for pointing out to the INEE measurement library. Julia, you have also been involved in the validation and in the development of measurement tools. And you have also been engaged on this Babylonian language confusion about what we mean by different SEL skills and competencies. Would you like to talk about your experience in these two areas of work?
Sure. Yes. So as was mentioned earlier, Sylvia and I co-chair INEE's PSS-SEL collaborative, and we're very excited to currently be working with Harvard's EISL lab together on a project that is aiming to develop various PSS and SEL tools that will enable us to develop and use holistic measurements more widely in the field of education in emergencies. And so this project is aiming to really increase that coherence, alignment, and understanding of PSS and SEL among a variety of stakeholders in the education sector, with a specific focus on EiE settings. And so as part of this project, we're developing a toolbox that aims to support donors, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to better understand these various concepts and frameworks that are used to conceptualize PSS and SEL across a variety of EiE contexts. And this work is really laying the foundation for developing indicators to track and measure PSS and SEL, which we know is necessary for measuring holistic learning outcomes. These tools also ensure that the conceptualization of PSS and SEL reflects the local culture and the social norms of a given context, as we really do acknowledge the localization process for integrating PSS and SEL into education programs and into measurements is very critical. So having a better understanding of how to really measure these holistic learning outcomes will help ensure greater inclusion of those factors in assessments in EiE settings. So, whether we're thinking about an initial rapid needs assessment used to inform a humanitarian response plan, all the way to, national level assessments for measuring learning and well-being, we see great value in making sure that we're contributing to increasing understanding so that that is possible going forward.
Thank you so much. Eva, you have talked about the linkage between low capacity, which leads to low ownership, and then low use of data. With your mandate on strengthening capacities, what do you see as a way out of this vicious cycle?
Yeah, so indeed, I will go back to the solutions in order to improve the use of learning data, focusing mostly on this issue of ownership. And so in our project, we asked ourselves indeed how to create conducive arrangements for a better ownership of learning assessment data, making sure that it is more understood as an internal endeavor and not some sort of an external thing that is not very relevant for national actors. And so our study shows that one of the most important things is to involve different actors in the entire cycle management of learning assessment data, meaning starting with the development of assessment tools right through the dissemination, because that will not only allow to address their data needs, but also create this understanding that this is indeed an internal data, that it is relevant and it is made for the system. We also saw that it is very important to minimize the outsourcing of different data management activities, especially data analysis, because that interrupts the national cycle of data management. And instead, of course, we encourage to build national capacities in the management and use of learning assessment data, which indeed is the most important engine to build these sustainable assessment systems. And in our study, we saw a very interesting example from the Zambia, where indeed from in the Gambia, where indeed from the highest political level, there was this push to develop national capacities, to develop a national assessment system, which led to a greater engagement and ownership of learning assessment data, and of course, a better use of this information. And finally, it is of course important to align assessment systems with the education system goals and priorities, and ensure that there is an effective feedback loop that goes throughout the entire education system that would encourage the use of this data. We saw that linking assessment information to specific planning activities at different levels and encouraging this can indeed help. For instance, in the Gambia, actors are encouraged to inform school improvement plans using this data, which indeed created a positive dynamic for the use. And we saw when there is no specific and explicit feedback expected and action expected after the release of assessment information, when then its use just remains very limited. So it's important to focus on these follow-up activities. And of course, these questions are indeed very complex, and there is a lot more to say, and we addressed them in our study. But I will now stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there is also Education Cannot Wait. Education Cannot Wait is a huge funding mechanism for education in emergencies, and has learning outcomes as a center theme. Christian, can you talk about education's commitment and plans to turn this commitment to learning outcomes into practice, to operationalize it?
Thank you, Gerhard, and nice to be connected in this webinar. Yes, indeed, I can confirm ACW is committed to promote the use of holistic learning outcome assessments in its programs. Since 2019, we made it mandatory for all our multi-year resilience program grantees. As you know, we are a global fund, and we provide funds to first emergency response, that is 6 to 12 months programs, as well as multi-year programs up to 3 years of funding to grantees. And in those programs, we require our grantees now to measure learning outcomes. So far, on a positive note, we can say that 72% of our MERPs, which we call the multi-year resilience programs, are measuring or are planning to measure academic learning outcomes. And more recently, since end of 2019, we introduced a heavy focus on MHPSS programming in our programs. We have also introduced sort of the holistic aspect of learning outcome measurements, and we have 56% of our programs that are measuring or are planning to measure SEL social emotional learning competencies. Now, to support the grantees in their work, we have recently launched a global initiative to strengthen systems for the measurement of holistic learning outcomes in crisis settings. This will actually focus on system strengthening work in 7 of our multi-year resilience programs. We have 18 in total that are active out there. And this focus is really on system strengthening rather than just developing the measures themselves. And we have partnerships with Cambridge Education as well as NYU TIES. These are global partners to implement this system strengthening initiative. This goes hand in hand to an initiative that we have on strengthening EMIS adapted to crisis settings, which we have in place since last year in partnership with UNESCO. In our work on capacity development, is important to note that we adopt a system change perspective. So we really work on system strengthening. What that means in a nutshell is development of measures is one side applicable to crisis settings and quality standards around data and processes. So the technical aspect of it, let's say, but also then putting in place systems that provide the incentives for partners to actually measure the holistic learning outcomes. And there we look for entry points in organizational frameworks in the agencies that we work with. So we have dialogue at global level to do that. We work at country level to look at integration or entry points, opportunities in cluster strategies, national EiE strategies, or more general in EiE programming that is happening at country level. The third element I would say is then to provide actually the resources, and that needs to be done in partnership with all the relevant actors, and that refers to actually making sure people from clusters, for example, are in place and have the capacities to measure learning outcomes. And we are working in close partnership with the Global Education Cluster to do so, that sufficient funding is provided, mechanisms and training materials to do so. All that should be done through a coordinated approach. And as ECW is a platform, we really emphasize that coordination approach to strengthening systems. So recently, we put in place a new INEE EiE data reference group, which I'm co-chairing and for which ECW provided the whole background research. What we do there basically is looking at more coordinated approach to EiE data and M&E system strengthening work. And a big part of it is on measurement of learning outcomes. And to structure the work of this group, we have put in place a theory of change, an overarching one, and a results framework, so that we move from just activity-based or mapping of activities of the different actors towards a structuring towards a results-based focus on actually strengthening those systems. And that systems approach has several components. One, which is very much in line with the points that I mentioned before, is on common indicators, measures, and standards. But it also includes a heavy component on strengthening the enabling environment, which is around the funding, which is around capacities developed and people in place having these capacities. For example, also institutional mechanisms to set standards around EiE data, and also to look at how we can strengthen the use of data for improved programming. The entire group, of course, is a multi-stakeholder platform, and the big advantage that I see is really that it combines measurement specialists, M&E specialists, EiE practitioners, donors, coordinators, and information managers. Each one of these actor groups has different approaches and different concepts that they have in mind when they talk about EiE data strengthening. So this group really helps to bring these different groups together to speak with a common language, because only then I think we can achieve the change around system strengthening that we want, and that we can see increasingly learning outcome measures in that work.
Thank you so much, Christian, for this overview of the spectrum, the wide spectrum of engagement of ECW. Yeah, I mean, I would like to talk now about the next steps and way forward. What can we do with the policy paper, or based on the policy paper and based on the solutions that are already on the way and that we have discussed and heard about? I would like to ask Nina to talk about what role donors can have to influence the assessment and the measurement of holistic learning outcomes in crisis and conflict.
Thanks so much, Gerhard. As many have said, understanding who is learning and who is not is critical to closing the equity gap. And also, as many have already said, collaboration is key. With learning data, we can work together to develop contextualized solutions to help crisis-affected children and youth learn and catch up. But we have to put resources behind it. So we as donors have to increase our commitments and embed and budget for not just direct data collection costs, but also understand the costs that are associated with analysis, dissemination, and as others have said, those important feedback loops, so that we're strengthening the system to be able to use this information as part of planning processes and strengthen the capacity of the whole system, both through the formal education ministry providers, but also through civil society and non-state actors who are critical partners in this process. We have an increased challenge as well, and USAID is particularly concerned with how COVID-related school closures are exacerbating the global learning crisis, particularly for learners in contexts experiencing multiple crises, such as displacement, natural disasters, and violent conflict. We're working with our partners to deploy and adapt education solutions to ensure all children return to learning, catch up, and recover lost learning. However, this adds a new layer of challenge for how do we measure learning that's happening as a result of distance learning solutions. In order to help advance this field, USAID has developed and produced recent guidance, the Roadmap for Measuring Distance Learning, a guide to effective monitoring and evaluation for access, engagement, and learning outcomes resulting from distance learning. This guide will help partner governments, local and international NGOs, and other stakeholders to design fit-for-purpose solutions to monitoring, evaluation, and learning challenges in the context of different modalities of education delivery. But we have to understand, and we must put resources behind both short-term as well as medium to long-term solutions that are going to build out the resilience capacities of the education institutions and the partners we're working with, so that when the next shock or stressor happens, we can understand the differentiated impact that these crises are having on various populations. And as I said before, contextualize our responses to help those particular learners who are furthest behind catch up, stay on track, or at the very least, mitigate learning loss. But again, we look forward to working with other partners, mobilizing our like-minded donors to really engage and co-fund these efforts and engage our ministry officials to put domestic resources behind these efforts. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina, for also talking about the impact of COVID and what that means in terms of measurement of distance learning. I would like finally to give the final word to Director General Abdi, and especially since with the Global Compact, with the Djibouti Declaration, and with national commitments towards inclusion, we see that national education systems are going to take an increasing role in inclusion of refugees into the national education systems. So perhaps, Director General, you can talk about what you see as the next steps in Kenya concretely in terms of measurement of holistic learning outcomes.
Gerhard, I think DG Abdi actually had to go. So unfortunately, we won't hear from him. Sorry about that, everybody. But I think with that, we can wrap up our panel discussion, Gerhard.
Yeah, okay, then I'll hand over to you for the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, panelists, for such a rich discussion, and to all the participants for all of the incredible questions that are coming in. Unfortunately, as is typical, we only have 10 more minutes, so we won't be able to get to all of your questions, but I'll do my best to kind of ask a few questions that are repetitive or particularly of interest given the panelists. We have captured all of the questions that have come in, so we'll do our best to answer some of those questions offline and share responses with you when we share the recording for this webinar and the presentation. I think many of the questions have actually been answered through the various presentations from the panelists, but I wanted to quickly go to Yeva to talk about a question that came in from Rachel who asks about who is best positioned to administer assessments. I know the studies that you've been conducting have given you an insight on this. So, and you highlighted that a little bit, but could you just tell us one more time, according to the work that you've been doing, who you think is the best position to administer assessments?
Yes, thank you very much. And it is indeed a very important and interesting question. So I would say that definitely the administration of learning assessments should remain in the hands of the national officials, of course, ensuring that they are supported with capacity development to administer these assessments. But it is very important that it is done by them and not externally. When it comes to choosing who in the education system should administer these assessments, whether it should be district, regional, level officials or teachers, is a bit more complex. I would say that it really depends on the type of the assessment. If it is a large-scale assessment that aims to inform the entire education system and policymakers, it probably makes sense that these are district level officials, as a certain level of standardization needs to be respected. However, if these assessments have more of a formative lenses, of course, it is very important that teachers do it, and that can indeed improve then the use of learning data by them. And the second part of this question was also how to make sure that then learning data are not used for negative purposes to increase competition. And this also is a very important risk that needs to be considered. And I would say that it's important to communicate and define the use of learning data right from the beginning and make sure that different actors understand that, which can then help avoid these unintended uses of data. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. And yeah, also noting what other panelists mentioned about multiple levels of involvement across education emergency actors in the data collection and assessment process is critical. And you'll see in the policy paper that there are recommendations across different types of actors on how best we can support the collection and measurement of holistic learning. I also wanted to flag that this policy paper comes after 2 mapping exercises. Many of you mentioned, what resources and tools are already available for assessment in education emergency contexts. And the 2 mapping exercises, we'll send a link in the chat in just a moment, capture what resources are available both for academic learning and social and emotional learning. So please do look at those. And Eva, you mentioned some specific challenges at the classroom level, and there was a question from Casey Pearson about how to overcome some of these challenges in order to still effectively collect reliable holistic assessment data. Casey mentioned, class sizes. I wanted to see if Sylvia, potentially, if you could answer this question about some of the logistical challenges and how to effectively collect reliable data. Sylvia, are you there?
Hi, sorry. Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Yes, logistical challenges with regards to. I mean, one of the main challenges is obviously the lack of measures that have been designed with like strong psychometric properties, and that the fact that the great majority of measures that exist out there to capture holistic learning outcomes have been designed in high-income countries, middle-income countries, or stable societies. But the ways in which a measure behaves in one setting doesn't necessarily replicate when you take it to a different setting. And so there's really not a lot of measures that can capture in valid and reliable ways the holistic learning outcomes. And so for that reason, and I was just actually typing on a question about whether the measures in the measurement library have been used to measure those things in context of conflict and crisis. And yes, they have actually been developed for use in those contexts. One of the challenges is that even when measures are available, even if there's a measure for which there's evidence of validity and reliability, and maybe the measure is feasible, there's also a lack of training materials. And so people have a thing, but maybe they are not able to conduct a high quality training in the context where they are intending to use the measure. And so that's a huge logistical challenge. The measurement library, all of the measures that are there, not only they have been included for, have been tested in context of conflict and crisis, but they do also include training materials so that you can take those and conduct your trainings in ways that are simple and are clear and are good enough. Another challenge is that, again, sometimes measures cannot just be taken from one place to another. So they all need to go through a process of adaptation and contextualization. And so it is important to do so. The measurement library includes as well like a measurement guidance to help practitioners and researchers and anybody interested in capture holistic learning outcomes identify whether a measure has been perhaps used in your setting, but perhaps has not actually been used with a specific age group, or has not been used in a given language. And so how do you take that and you do the translations, the back translations, the cognitive pretesting? How do you pilot the measures to collect evidenceability and reliability? And so we include guidance for how to further adapt the measures, so that they can be used in valid and reliable ways.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, I encourage everyone to go look at the measurement library, the flow of, what exactly you're looking for is really nice there. You can choose exactly what you need for the type of measurement you want to do. I want to ask another question to our panelist, Audrey, about questions of inclusion. A couple of participants have mentioned assessments when it comes to children who are speakers of marginalized languages, and collecting data around language of instruction, as well as children with disabilities. Audrey, can you talk to us a little bit about inclusion when it comes to data collection and assessment?
Indeed, thank you, Margie. Very relevant question when it comes to equity, because it's been indeed documented that some non-native language learners may be excluded from surveys and other measurement efforts. In addition, some competencies cannot be effectively assessed when the learners do not master the language of instruction. In math, for example, when insufficient reading capacities prevent a proper understanding of the questions, and therefore the competency cannot be assessed in mathematics, when actually the problem might be in language. So the mapping tool, again, I would refer our participants back to this, because there we identify tools that have been designed in where multiple languages are spoken. There are also some tools that assess students in the language of instruction. That's the case of the recent PASEC 2019 evaluation, which included in some countries a sample of schools using local national languages when these schools were available. Clearly, to reach out to more students, there is a need to contextualize the tools, as Sylvia and Eva mentioned earlier. And this has been done by several teams developing assessments like for ALDO and others. Again, examples can be found in the mapping. I would like to reiterate the efforts that also need to be done in terms of capacity building, translation of guidelines, support to surveyors, which calls for stronger involvement of local actors at subnational levels. It can also be with organizations for who are specialized to supporting with specific needs who can be involved. However, we know that a key issue here is the lack of resources, because it calls for additional financial resources, which is very often lacking. But again, advocacy might be key, as indeed, as mentioned in the paper, the cost of inaction can be higher in terms of loss of learning for children who might be excluded from assessments. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. And I believe Nina and Christian also alluded to the similar challenges and the dedication that's needed from donor side to account for the various costs related to doing holistic learning outcomes. There's still lots of questions that remain unanswered, but I thank all of our panelists and participants. We will be sure to capture all of the questions and respond to them and send them to you via email when we share the recording and the presentation for this webinar. Thank you once again, everyone. If panelists, you could turn your camera on and just wave goodbye to our participants. We're so thankful for everyone's participation today. We hope the policy paper is useful for you, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. And thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you may be. Bye.
Thanks, Margie.
Thank you. Bye, Maggie. Bye, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.